This girl was looking at herself in the mirror with concern. She felt that her appearance didn't resemble that of a noble princess at all, because not only could she not guarantee basic living necessities, but she was also wearing a maid's outfit. However, wearing the maid's outfit was her choice. She thought if she could continue to pretend to be a maid, it would be fine to live on like that. He was like a god of war known as the Lion of the Battlefield. Lucia had a sudden idea. If she could sign a marriage contract with him in advance, wouldn't she be able to change this tragic fate? At this moment, Lucia was sitting in the hall, leisurely enjoying some desserts. The crispy and sweet taste made Lucia praise the butler endlessly, exclaiming that it was absolutely delicious. What shocked the Duke even more was that there were rumors that the Duchess was a peerless beauty and that the Duke had abducted her to his territory to prevent her from being seen. The phrase peerless beauty reminded the Duke of Lucia's radiant smile. He felt the rumor might not be entirely baseless. After reading the complete report, the Duke thought these rumors didn't seem to cause any major problems. Lucia never expected that right after she had bathed, with her hair still damp, the Duke would impatiently pick her up. Ignoring her struggles, he directly started kissing her. Although Lucia protested verbally, her arms wrapped around the Duke's neck, the Duke found Lucia's contradictory behavior too adorable. We'll skip the next paid segment. After that, Lucia was curious why the Duke had sent Damien to a boarding school. The Duke, holding Lucia, explained that it was because of Damien's illegitimate status. There would be many obstacles among the ministers and nobles. After all, there had never been a precedent of an illegitimate child becoming the heir. To protect Damien from strange looks and rumors, he was sent to a boarding school where no one could interfere. After learning the reason, Lucia suggested letting Damien stay in Rouen, but the Duke told her that he had promised Damien he would let him inherit his position after graduation. If he didn't go to boarding school now, Damien might feel he was being deprived of his inheritance rights. Hearing the Duke's words, Lucia realized she hadn't considered everything thoroughly. The Duke couldn't help but reach out and gently caress her cheek. Then he embraced Lucia and kissed her again. It's another familiar paid segment, so we'll skip it. The next morning, Lucia opened her eyes but soon felt drowsy again due to exhaustion. When she woke up again, she found a warm hand stroking her forehead. The Duke, hearing Lucia hadn't woken up, was worried and came to check on her. The Duke leaned close to Lucia, expressing relief that she seemed to be fine. After saying this, he couldn't help but kiss her. At this moment, Lucia suddenly let out a scream. The butler was quite speechless. He had never seen anyone so at ease in the Duke's house. Lucia thought that if she could become the Duchess, she could enjoy such delicious pastries and red tea every day. These benefits were simply too good. At this moment, the Duke's voice came telling the butler to leave first. Then she pulled up the blanket and wrapped herself tightly. The Duke was worried, not knowing what was wrong with Lucia. Lucia stammered, unable to speak for a while. The Duke thought Lucia was sick, so he suddenly got up to call a doctor. Lucia quickly stopped the Duke. She poked her head out from under the blanket and told the Duke that because she hadn't dried her hair properly yesterday, her hairstyle was now a mess. Lucia didn't want the person she liked to see her unkempt side. The Duke rolled his eyes in exasperation, pulled away Lucia's blanket, then sat down and gazed at her adoringly, saying, "You're really beautiful." But Lucia scornfully retorted that the Duke was a playboy who said that to everyone. Then she lay down, pouting. The Duke was at a loss. He felt that Lucia must have a long grudge list where she had recorded him like that. Lucia was stunned by this comment. Then she sat up and asked the Duke what he meant by a grudge list. The Duke was a bit embarrassed but patiently explained to Lucia, "It's like you have a list in your head to record your dissatisfaction with me where you curse me. Don't you diligently record it item by item?" Hearing this, Lucia's expression gradually lost control. Then she burst into laughter. The Duke watched Lucia laughing so hard her stomach hurt, feeling bewildered. He didn't understand why she suddenly started laughing when he was talking about something serious. Lucia hadn't expected that the esteemed Duke would have such strange ideas and even seriously explain it to her. Seeing Lucia laughing to tears, the Duke felt utterly confused. He still couldn't understand what Lucia was laughing about. Lucia wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and continued to ask when new content would be added to the grudge list. The Duke coldly retorted, "Why are you asking me? Shouldn't you know better?" This sentence made Lucia burst into laughter again. She held her stomach and rolled on the bed laughing. The Duke beside her was full of confusion. Lucia never imagined that the Duke could have such an innocent side. She explained to the Duke through tears of laughter that she didn't have the kind of grudge list he mentioned, nor had she accumulated so many complex emotions. At this point, the Duke suddenly leaned close to Lucia and questioned, "Then what did you mean earlier when you called me a playboy?" However, Lucia was in a panic because she had just taken a big bite of the dessert. In front of the Duke, Lucia could only cover her mouth and chew desperately, hoping to swallow it quickly. Lucia was stunned for a moment, then shyly answered that it was because he suddenly said she was beautiful. Lucia felt that the word beautiful seemed to have nothing to do with her. The Duke didn't understand. He had just expressed what he saw and felt. Was there something wrong with that? Lucia's heart suddenly started racing. She realized that a casual remark from the Duke could affect her so much. Lucia grabbed her hair and asked the Duke shyly and hesitantly, "Do I really look beautiful like this?" The Duke sighed helplessly, "I don't know what you're fretting about." Then he looked at Lucia seriously and said, "You're really beautiful." Lucia was stunned. She thought to herself, the Duke is so excellent that even if he did nothing, many women would approach him. So he probably didn't need to say such polite words, right? Could it be that the Duke was telling the truth? Thinking of this, Lucia's cheeks instantly heated up. Seeing Lucia not responding for a long time, the Duke thought there might be a problem with his way of expressing it. Then the Duke used all his learned compliments on Lucia, beautiful beyond compare, as radiant as the stars. So beautiful, it's hard to look directly at you. Seeing the Duke say this so easily, Lucia suddenly felt like he was just teasing her. The Duke was getting a bit impatient. He didn't know what exactly had made Lucia unsatisfied. At this moment, Lucia shyly asked the Duke again, "Am I really beautiful?" Lucia understood that even if the Duke was being insincere, hearing his compliments would still make her happy. The Duke looked at Lucia and seriously stated again, "You are really beautiful." This answer made Lucia completely fall for him, and she smiled sweetly. At this point, the Duke warned Lucia not to smile like that anymore, or he wouldn't be able to control himself. The Duke noticed that Lucia seemed more relaxed than before he left for the battlefield. During his absence, the Duke had been constantly thinking about her. Although he was grateful for reconciling with Lucia before leaving, he felt there was something unfinished lingering in his mind. The Duke now understood that he wanted to have Lucia completely, both her body and heart. At this moment, Lucia smiled and gently asked the Duke how his work had been recently. The Duke was surprised to find that Lucia's tone seemed much softer than before. He realized that Lucia was happy when complimented on her looks. The Duke thought this discovery was quite nice. But then an accident occurred. She choked, so she hurriedly picked up the hot red tea on the table. With tears in her eyes, she gulped it down. The Duke watched her silently with a speechless expression. Lucia's cheeks gradually turned red. She felt this was too embarrassing. What exactly did the Duke say that made Lucia's cheeks burn? They were originally talking about work matters. Lucia firmly believed that the Duke couldn't stop working and must work hard to earn money to support his wife. Lucia's childish idea made the Duke laugh so hard he cried. Lucia was very confused. Although she liked seeing him laugh, she really didn't understand what was so funny about what she said. The Duke said that supporting her wasn't difficult. He earned money and gave it to her, but she didn't seem to spend much. Lucia looked aggrieved. She insisted that she did spend money. After all, hosting a banquet cost a lot, and she had also bought flowers to plant in the garden. However, in the Duke's eyes, these were trivial. He wanted Lucia to spend his money on personal items like dresses and jewelry. But Lucia, who had grown up without support, was used to a frugal life. She thought that tailoring dresses was expensive, and the accessories in the Tiran family treasury were enough for her to use for a lifetime. Generally, families with titles would have closed and accessories passed down through generations, but in case of divorce, these wouldn't belong to the wife. So to be prepared, noble ladies would strive to purchase a large number of accessories. The Duke thought Lucilla must know this, so he shyly asked her if she didn't want to spend his money. Lucia was surprised to find that she had never seen the Duke like this before. She covered her face with both hands, unable to suppress the love bubbles popping up. Thinking this version of the Duke was incredibly cute, Lucia also hadn't expected the Duke to be so thoughtful. She smiled and explained to the Duke that she simply didn't like buying non-essential items. Learning the reason, the Duke was still displeased. He wanted Lucia to spend his money but couldn't order her to do so. Meanwhile, Lucia continued to gaze at the Duke adoringly, covering her face. It was the first time the Duke had met someone like Lucia who had no desire for power or money. He wanted to know Lucia's demands so he could keep her by his side and prevent her from leaving him. The Duke suddenly wondered if it was about children. Thinking of this, the Duke helplessly clenched his fists. This was something he could never give her. Suddenly, the Duke thought that if he could make Lucia feel lonely and unable to sleep when he wasn't around, perhaps this primal desire could keep her with him. After taking a big sip of red tea, Lucia finally swallowed it. The Duke looked at Lucia and sighed. But before that, he needed to confirm with Lucia if she liked it. The Duke glanced at Lucia. Then he directly asked Lucia if she enjoyed spending nights with him. Hearing this, Lucia was stunned. Her cheeks instantly turned burning hot. Then she turned around, lay down, and covered herself with the blanket, saying she needed to sleep more. she told the Duke to go to work. However, the Duke kept asking incessantly. Lucia had to lift the blanket and loudly admit that she liked it very much, telling the Duke not to say any more. Hearing this, the Duke was very happy. Then he stood up and leaned close to Lucia. At this point, Lucia became very flustered, asking if he had no sense of time and place. Next is the paid segment that everyone dislikes. We'll skip it directly. Early in the morning, the Duke looked through the window. He saw Lucia and Damien again in the garden, walking and talking. He noticed that their relationship seemed to be getting better and better. The Duke couldn't understand. Damien usually didn't get close to others, but Lucia had managed to tame this beast-like child into an obedient puppy in just a few weeks. He recalled the butler's uncontrollable smile when introducing the Duchess. He realized that Lucia seemed to have some superpower that made everyone take her side. However, Lucio is going to host a garden party tomorrow. The Duke wasn't sure if bringing Damien would be problem-free. After all, the nobles and social circles wouldn't believe that the Duchess would genuinely care for her husband's illegitimate child. Many would surely suspect her motives. When Philip brought Damien years ago, he told him this was Hugo's son. At first, he didn't believe it. But Philip explained that young Master Hugo already had a lover. The Duke also remembered Hugo, saying he had someone he wanted to marry. But after Hugo's death, Damien's mother also died in childbirth. He handed the marriage contract to Lucia, asking her to sign these two contracts. Lucia looked at them. One was a waiver of infringement and the other was a naturalization consent form. At that time, the Duke was busy with the war. He hastily found a wet nurse for Damien and went to the battlefield, never mentioning that Damien was his son. But unexpectedly, half a year later, when he returned to Roy, he found that everyone was treating Damien as his biological son. Meanwhile, Lucia, holding the little fox given by Katie, asked Damien to name it. Damien looked down at the docile and cute little fox, then replied, "Let's call him Asha." Lucia was curious. "Does the name Asha have any meaning?" Damien explained, "I hope he can grow up healthy and have a strong vitality like this name suggests." Actually, when Lucia asked him to name the little fox, he even put aside his studies and frantically flipped through dictionaries to find this name. Of course, he didn't intend to tell Lucia this. Lucia hugged the cute little fox, nuzzling it against her face. She thought Asha was a great name, then she directly handed Asha to Damien. "You named him, so give him a hug." Damien immediately became nervous and flustered, not knowing what to do. However, Lucia continued to urge him. Damien reluctantly reached out and took Asha. He held it tightly in his arms. He discovered that he could actually feel the pulse of this little life beating. He told Lucia that his feelings were strange. Lucia bent down worriedly and asked what was wrong. Damien felt that he didn't dislike this feeling, but it was a bit uncomfortable and his heart felt a little warm. Lucia leaned down to be at eye level with Damien. She told him this was a feeling called affection. When affection is full, the heart feels tight. At this moment, Asha suddenly yawned. He even nuzzled his little head against Damien's chest. This scene made Damien smile genuinely. At this time, the Duke arrived. Lucia told the Duke that this was the little fox Miss Katie had given her. The Duke glanced at the little fox, thinking that it seemed she planned to take this little fellow everywhere from now on. At this time, the Duke began to examine Lucia. He thought that although Lucia's appearance was ordinary and her figure was average, the color of her eyes was quite special, like pumpkins. Lucia often took Damien with her when she went out, and now there was also a little fox. The Duke couldn't help but sigh, realizing that he still had a long way to go to completely win Lucio over. The Duke was quite displeased because he found that not only was Damien competing with him for his wife, now there was also an adorable little fox. He felt that he still had a long way to go to completely win Lucio over. So he seriously told Damien that fox hunting was a boring pastime, unhelpful for real hunting, and told him to return the little fox to its owner. Hearing this, Lucio became very angry. How could he say that petting a little fox was a boring pastime? It was clearly so much fun. However, Damien didn't dare disobey the Duke's words and had to immediately return Asha to Lucia. The Duke then turned and told Damien to follow him. Lucia, holding Asha, was confused. Where was the Duke taking Damien? The Duke replied, "We're gonna have a man-to-man talk." Then Damien looked up at the Duke and followed him, leaving Lucia standing there dumbfounded. Lucia was displeased. She loudly questioned, "Are you two isolating me now? Damien, I've been trying so hard to get close to you, and with just one word from your father, you turn and run off with him." After complaining, Lucia showed an angelic smile again. She sincerely hoped that the father and son would become so close that it would make her jealous. The Duke looked at the dazed Damien, feeling a bit awkward. He realized that although he had brought him over, he didn't know what to say. So he casually inquired about Damien's situation at school. When he learned that Damien loved reading books, he took him to his study. Damien was shocked by the enormous study. This study had always been off limits to everyone except Lucia. At this point, the observant Damien noticed that there was another door in the study. He curiously pointed at that door and asked, "Is that also a study?" But the Duke told him it was full of trash. In fact, that room held the secrets of the Tyran family. Only the head of the Tyran family could enter. The Duke also planned to burn everything inside before Damien inherited the title. However, after reading through the contracts, Lucia found that none of the marriage conditions she proposed last time were included. Lucia asked the Duke why they weren't written. "Don't you want freedom in your private life? Is it okay if I cling to you if I fall in love with you?" The Duke told Damien, "You can look around freely. If you want to read, you can come in any time." After thanking the Duke, Damien scampered off towards a study. The Duke remembered how Damien smiled while holding the little fox. It was exactly like his deceased brother. The Duke realized that the person he missed the most had been by his side all along. Damien hadn't inherited the madness in the Terran family's blood. He was kind, pure, and loved life. The Duke believed that the Terran family would surely be renewed under Damien's leadership. In the blink of an eye, it was the day of the banquet. The invited ladies gradually arrived at the Duke's mansion. Katie warmly greeted Lucia, but Lucia noticed that Mrs. Mitchell hadn't come. Katie expressed some regret, telling Lucia that the elderly lady was in poor health and couldn't make it. At this moment, a maid informed Lucia that the young master was waiting in the first-floor hall. So Lucia hurriedly said goodbye to Katie and followed the servant. Meanwhile, Katie was worried about whether this banquet would proceed smoothly. She knew that Lucia wanted Damien to make his formal appearance at this banquet, but those noble ladies were ignorant and arrogant, especially in their attitudes towards an illegitimate son inheriting the title. She wasn't sure if Lucia could handle it. The biggest obstacle for this banquet was the Countess of Wells. She was of equal status to her grandmother, but despite her high reputation, she was obsessed with power and enjoyed others' flattery. Katie just hoped that the Countess of Wells wouldn't stir up trouble and ruin the banquet today. The Duke was working in his study, but he was still worried about today's banquet. He asked the butler about the banquet preparations. Although the butler assured him that everything was going very smoothly, the idea of Damien appearing at the banquet still made him uneasy. At this point, the Duke seemed to remember something. He asked the butler if he had ever heard the name Lucia. The butler honestly replied that he had, saying it was the madam's pet name. He only learned about it by chance when he heard Miss Katie addressing the madam that way. Hearing this, the Duke looked terrified. Then he slumped back in his chair as if deflated. The Duke had also heard this nickname by chance in Damien's conversation. He had thought it was a special name between them, but now he realized that everyone knew Vivian had this nickname Lucia except for himself. The Duke's veins popped out, feeling utterly speechless. He had to verbally promise. Having received the Duke's promise, Lucia picked up the pen and was about to sign. The Duke felt that Lucia's heart was still closed to him, never having opened. Since his brother's death, the Duke's world seemed to have lost its color, but meeting Lucia had brought color back to his world. He thought his long frozen heart had started beating again. The Duke understood that although Lucia was now his wife, marriage couldn't bind one's heart. He worried about what he would do if Lucia ever fell in love with someone else. Meanwhile, the maid led Lucia to meet Damien, who was waiting in the hall. Lucia covered her mouth in astonishment. She found that Damien in a tailcoat looked exactly like the Duke. She then urged Damien to follow her. But Damien stood still, clenching his fists. He was still hesitant. Lucia understood Damien's concerns. She told him that in the future he would stand before many more people. Today was just the beginning. He didn't need to feel any burden. She even put her hands on her hips and said that if anyone bullied him, she would stand up for him. Damien stared blankly at Lucia. Lucia thought Damien found her unreliable, so she added that she could also tell his father, who would surely teach anyone who bothered him a lesson. Damien was successfully amused by Lucia. Lucia directly took Damien's hand, telling him to follow her. Damien, with a flushed face, looked up at Lucia's back. For some reason, he found Lucia incredibly alluring at that moment. Her radiance was so captivating that he couldn't take his eyes off her. On the Duke's side, Secretary Yashin brought an urgent report about an epidemic. Dozens of residents in an area not far from Royan had shown the same symptoms and fallen ill collectively. At this moment, the Duke was so surprised that he sat up straight. "Of state of my conditions. Don't you have any conditions of your own?" The Duke sighed helplessly. Then he instructed Yashin to arrange for immediate departure and to find a doctor who could ride a horse to accompany them. Lucia stood on the terrace, smiling as she welcomed the guests. Although she had previously organized some small-scale tea parties, this garden party was by far the largest she had ever hosted. The invited guests were of varying status and rank. Lucia told the guests at the party that she wanted to take this opportunity to introduce someone to them. Then she brought Damien to her side. Damien's appearance caused a stir in the garden. Although Katie was a bit worried, she silently cheered for Lucia in her heart. Lucia introduced Damien to the guests as the young master of the Tarun family, who would inherit the title of Duke of Tarun and become the head of the Tarun family in the future. This announcement surprised the guests in the garden. The Countess of Wells, however, slammed her teacup down on the table with a loud thud. This action caught Lucia's attention. She looked at the Countess and asked if there was a problem. The Count is coldly stated, "As far as I know, today is a banquet for ladies. This seems to be against the rules, doesn't it?" Lucia shielded Damien behind her and firmly refuted that he was just a child. Although he was a boy, such things were not uncommon in the capital. Lucia knew her firm attitude might hurt the Countess's pride, but she wanted to warn the Countess that even a celebrity in the northern social circle was just a frog in a well compared to the capital. The Countess didn't expect Lucia to dare speak to her like this, because she had foreseen in her dream that Duke Taryn's fiancée was neither a noble's daughter nor a wealthy heiress, but a naive and lovely girl next door. The dumbfounded Lucia was a bit confused. She then gave a cold smile. She had heard various rumors about the Duchess circulating in the capital, and Lucia's marriage to the Duke was also full of suspicions. She believed that the Duke was not the type to be held back by a woman, so the rumors about the Duke and Duchess being in perfect harmony must also be false. The Countess cleverly assumed that if Lucia wanted to maintain her high position, she would definitely need a reliable ally. Her actions today were meant to show Lucia her influence in order to form a connection. She coughed twice. The previously buzzing garden suddenly became unusually quiet. The guests all covered their mouths. They sat expressionless like dolls except for Katie, who realized this was heading towards a ruined banquet. She tried hard to ease the atmosphere. She made efforts to chat with her neighbors on both sides. However, it was to no avail. A ruined banquet refers to a verbal battle between the host and the guests. The method of ruining a banquet is for the participants to remain silent. If some problems occur during the banquet leading to its ruin, the participants will maintain a silent stance until the issue is resolved. If no one of similar social status to the initiator steps and to break the deadlock, then according to custom, others should tacitly agree and follow this behavior. Katie gripped her skirt, thinking that if her great-grandmother were present, it wouldn't have come to this. All she could do was try to make some noise while eating. This feeling was sometimes even more cruel than a real battlefield. "Can I also propose conditions?" she repeatedly confirmed with the Duke. What's worse, Lucia also realized it was a ruined banquet. She had witnessed ruined banquets in her dreams. They only occur at large-scale women's gatherings. The solution is for the host and the participants to reach a superficial reconciliation. Otherwise, if the banquet collapses midway, it would be a great shame for the host. Lucia certainly knew that having Damien leave would resolve the situation, but she had no intention of doing so. So she faced the crowd in the garden with a determined look and announced a pause in the banquet. This news caused the commotion among the guests. To protect Damien, Lucia angrily announced that she would end the banquet early. Back in her room, Lucia sighed helplessly, covering her face. She couldn't understand why the Countess of Wells would publicly humiliate her. This was clearly a losing proposition for her. After all, in the north, the Tarun family's power was above all else. Lucia, like a deflated balloon, leaned back on the sofa. She felt that she should have been more cautious about Damien's adoption and inheritance of the title. Lucia didn't know how the Duke would resolve this matter when he returned, but then she remembered the Duke's indifferent expression when he learned that she wanted to bring Damien to social gatherings. Perhaps the Duke hadn't even considered this matter. Lucia blamed herself for being too hasty. Because she was worried that Damien would soon return to boarding school, she felt she couldn't waste this opportunity. As a result, she messed it up. Lucia stood up and looked out the window. She didn't know how Damien would view this incident. Thinking about this, Lucia felt a headache coming on. At this moment, Lucia remembered that she had already sent a maid to call Damien, but he hadn't come yet. It turned out the maid had already gone to fetch Damien, but he had ignored her. Lucia continued to ask what Damien was doing outside. The Duke was a bit impatient, telling her if she didn't sign today, the offer would expire. Lucia thought for a moment. She wanted to ask the Duke one last question. The maid hesitantly replied that the young master was just staring at her expressionlessly. Meanwhile, the garden was in an uproar. Guests were discussing how the usually gentle Duchess had become angry. The Countess of Wells, on the other hand, felt unprecedented fear. She recalled Lucia's harsh words as she left in anger. You who have insulted the mistress of the Tyran family today will soon find that this was not a wise action. One day your sons or grandsons will serve my son as their master. Let your descendants bear the consequences of this account. The Countess of Wells had thought that Lucia would panic when faced with a ruined banquet and hastily send the young master out to ease the atmosphere. Then she would bow her head and apologize when Lucia calmed down, thus repairing the Duchess's wounded pride and forming a close alliance with her. But she never expected that everything would exceed her expectations. In the room, Lucia was calming herself down. Katie held Lucia's hand, comforting her that she shouldn't be too upset or feel too embarrassed. Lucia actually didn't care about these things. She was grateful for Katie's support at the banquet. What truly saddened her was the feeling of helplessness. She just learned from the butler that the Duke wasn't in the mansion. She felt somewhat relieved that the Duke wasn't there, yet also melancholic because of his absence. Later, she told the butler that she would inform the Duke about today's events herself, no need to relay it. What exactly happened that made both Damien and Lucia's eyes red from crying? After the butler left, Damien came to the room. Lucia casually waved, inviting Damien to her side. Unexpectedly, Damien lowered his head and knelt before Lucia, saying, "I'm sorry, it's all my fault." Lucia stood up in shock. Her eyes gradually moistened. "You don't need to apologize, this clearly isn't your fault." Lucia recalled the events at today's banquet. She hugged Damien tightly, feeling very guilty. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Damien had said from the beginning that he didn't want to go, but she had insisted on persuading him. "Why don't you accept your lover's love?" This question made the Duke fall into silence. The result was this chaotic ending. Lucia believed it was all her fault. In fact, Damien didn't care about those strange women's affairs at all. He was already used to such rumors. Along with constant apologies, Lucia's sorrowful tears fell like a spring. Damien slowly reached out to hug Lucia back. He really was fine, but he didn't know why he couldn't help but cry. Damien wanted to tell Lucia not to worry because when she spoke about him, he had already forgotten those words. He wanted Lucia to stop crying for him, but his throat felt blocked and he couldn't make a sound. This was the first time someone had cried for him. In the evening, the Duke finally returned, covered in dust from his journey. The butler, seeing the Duke's return, hurriedly went to greet him. Upon learning from the butler that dinner wasn't ready yet, the Duke went to the study. As soon as he sat down, he saw a mountain of documents in front of him. He casually picked up a document and inquired about today's garden party. The butler hesitated. He remembered that the Duchess had said she would personally inform the Duke about today's events, so he could only reply that the party went smoothly. Lucia suddenly heard that the Duke had returned. She instructed her maid to quickly bring her a towel soaked in cold water. Her face was flushed as she thought about how it was obvious she had been crying hard. She didn't want the Duke to know she had cried like this over such a small matter. After applying the cold compress, her eyes seemed a bit more normal but still somewhat swollen. Lucia felt very low. She shouldn't have cried like this over such a small matter. Then she asked the maid beside her, "Is the swelling of my eyes very noticeable?" The maid told her it wasn't too obvious at first glance. Lucia thought it over. She decided to get through dinner tonight and then casually tell the Duke about today's events later in the evening. She was curious how the Duke would react when he found out. Lucia never expected the Duke to be so attentive. As soon as he sat down in the dining room, his pupils dilated, noticing her red eyes from crying. Seeing no reaction from the Duke, Lucia started to imagine. He lifted Lucia's chin, asking worriedly, "What's wrong?" "Have you been crying?" Lucia avoided his gaze, not wanting the Duke to see her like this. She told him to finish dinner first before talking, but the Duke couldn't calm down at all. He angrily questioned the butler about what had happened. The butler truthfully told the Duke that the noble ladies had initiated a ruined banquet at the garden party. Upon learning the reason, the Duke felt very guilty. He shouldn't have left her at this time, allowing those decadent and ignorant ladies to hurt his innocent wife. The Duke urgently wanted to know what those people had done to Lucia. Lucia had originally planned to casually tell the Duke about this after dinner, but now she felt like a child who had been wronged. She wanted to tell the Duke it was nothing, but as she tried to speak, tears began to fall in large drops. This broke the Duke's heart. He could only pick Lucio up and let her lean on his shoulder. Then he instructed the butler to bring the meal upstairs. Before leaving, he didn't forget to add that Damien should return to his room after dinner. With that, he carried Lucia back to their bedroom. Damien was a bit worried. He knew Lucia hadn't left her room all day. He hoped to see his mother smiling as usual tomorrow. Back in the bedroom, the Duke gently patted Lucia's back to comfort her. But Lucia couldn't hold back and began to sob loudly, like a child who cries more easily when comforted. It was as if the Duke was telling her that this wasn't her fault. At this moment, although the Duke was still gently comforting Lucia, a raging fire had already ignited in his heart. He didn't know what those people had done to Lucia, whom he wouldn't even hurt a hair on to make her so heartbroken. The Duke thought he must not let them off because he understood that although Lucia looked delicate on the outside, her heart was very strong. And for her to cry so bitterly like this. Perhaps the Duke had been rejected when proposing before. After calming down, Lucia rubbed her swollen eyes. She noticed that the Duke's clothes were all wet. Only then did she realize what she had done to a husband who had just finished work. Lucia felt a bit ashamed, so she reached out to unbutton the Duke's clothes, intending to help him change. However, when she undid all the cuffs, this heart-stirring physique made her involuntarily swallow. She even unconsciously reached out to caress it. At this moment, Lucia suddenly came to her senses again. She quickly turned her head away with a blushing face, saying she would go get a new set of clothes. But the Duke grabbed Lucia's hand and pulled her back, giving her a mist of his smile. Seeing the Duke's passionate gaze, Lucia's heart couldn't help but race. Lucia was used to being the only one in the Duke's eyes. She feared that the flame in the Duke's eyes when he looked at her would cool down, so she took the initiative to lean in and kiss the Duke. Lucilla was being too naughty. After teasing the Duke, she suddenly wanted to get off the ride. She pushed the Duke away, saying it was all her fault for making him miss dinner. The handsome Duke was speechless. In this situation, you can still think about eating, he said, then embraced Lucilla again. Lucilla struggled, asking the Duke to wait, but the Duke certainly couldn't wait. He told Lucilla that missing a meal or two wouldn't matter. Lucia suddenly put on a pitiful expression, saying she was hungry too, helpless. The Duke had to tidy up Lucia's to shovel clothes and then pick her up in his arms. He thought it was fine if he went hungry, but he couldn't let his dear wife go without food. Lucia didn't expect the Duke would actually get up without hesitation. She felt a bit regretful in her heart. What a contradictory woman. After they finished eating, the Duke came to Lucia's side, bending down to gently ask if she was still upset. The petite Lucia leaned on the Duke's shoulder, answering that she was fine now. Because she had cried it out, she felt much better. Did I remind him of a painful marriage? Lucia curiously asked the Duke in return. Haven't you ever had times like this? The Duke thought of his deceased brother, but he didn't want to bring it up. He told Lucia he had never cried. Then the Duke changed the subject, asking Lucia to tell him what exactly happened today. Lucia casually said it was just because introducing Damien had offended the guests, and she didn't want to back down, so she ended the party. Finally, she emphasized that this was just a very common occurrence. The Duke didn't believe a word of Lucia's lie. He continued to ask what else happened that made her cry until her eyes were swollen. Lucia reiterated that there really wasn't anything else. She was just sad because she had caused harm to Damien. The Duke thought for a moment and felt she wouldn't reveal anymore. But speaking of Damien, the Duke remembered that Lucia had never asked him about Damien before. He had previously thought Lucia didn't care at all. He didn't expect Lucia would cry for that boy. So he asked Lucia why she never inquired about Damien from him. It turned out that the reason Lucia never mentioned this was because when signing the marriage contract, she had brought up Damien. She noticed that the Duke was full of caution. If she were to dig deeper after marriage, Lucia feared the Duke would suspect she had ulterior motives. The Duke suddenly felt he couldn't refute. He realized that Lucia could always perceive people's hearts in subtle ways. Lucia not only refused to be intimate with the Duke, but even wanted to send him to sleep in the study. Just now, the Duke told Lucia that he had called Damien back because of the adoption matter. Lucia was a bit surprised. She had thought this had been taken care of long ago. The Duke looked at Lucia and explained that even if she had agreed before, he wouldn't have done it without saying a word. Lucia really hadn't expected that the Duke would care so much about her feelings. Seeing her surprised expression, the Duke understood that Lucia must have thought of him as a villain again, so he turned his head with a grieved face and complained to Lucia. This suddenly made Lucia feel guilty, thinking she had wronged him. So she hurriedly patted her chest and explained that she didn't think that way at all. She clumsily praised the Duke as a super great lord, saying that before coming to the north, she didn't know it was such a stable and livable place. Faced with Lucia's explanation, His Grace the Duke didn't seem to buy it. Thinking of this, Lucia covered her mouth with her hand, feeling a bit restless. If that's really the case, would he be devastated? The Duke was very depressed, not knowing what Lucia's train of thought was this time. Actually, the Duke just felt bored because it was the first time someone had asked him this. However, he did think that women were too troublesome, always wanted to get answers. Lucia hastily changed the subject, saying Damien would be her son from now on. Thinking of Damien's bright smile, Lucia felt very content. She made a silent vow that even if she and her husband divorced in the future, Damien would always be her son. However, the Duke told Lucia, you can treat your son as you like, just don't let yourself be bullied in return. Lucia was very angry when she heard this. She loudly refuted, Damien would never bully me. You don't know how well behaved he is. The Duke leaned closer to Lucia. He was very puzzled about where Lucia's trust came from. Faced with the Duke so close, Lucia nervously swallowed. Then she explained to the Duke that it was because Damien was very much like him. The Duke stared intently at Lucia. He replied with a slightly threatening tone, "If he's like me, you should be even more careful. How many heard about me?" The Duke's intimidating presence made Lucia very nervous. She thought the Duke was referring to drinking blood. The Duke looked confused, not understanding what Lucia meant. At this moment, the slow-to-react Lucia realized she had misspoken. She hurriedly gestured and explained, "Just some rumors about you." The Duke couldn't help but laugh. He had never heard rumors about himself before. Then he tightly embraced the petite Lucia and asked, "How did you become curious about this?" Lucia quickly denied it, saying that was only in the past, but now she absolutely wouldn't have such thoughts. Seeing Lucia's flustered explanation, the Duke couldn't help but smile. He involuntarily leaned closer to Lucia and teased, "You're quite a brave woman daring to marry a blood-drinking monster." Lucia shyly replied, "Don't make fun of me." As soon as she finished speaking, the Duke embraced Lucia and kissed her. But Lucia suddenly pushed the Duke away. She said, "We can't, sir, you should go to work now." Then she abruptly stood up, making a random excuse. Saying she was too exhausted today, her head hurt a bit, so she needed to go out for a walk to get some fresh air. After saying this, she forcefully pushed the Duke, telling him to get out. The Duke was very helpless. He could only console himself that there would still be a chance before bed at night. Lucia rolled her eyes. The Duke was truly miserable. Not only was he rejected 3 times in one day, but now he was even being kicked out of the room. When Lucia rejected him for the second time, he still had some hope, thinking there would still be a chance before bed at night. However, when he came to the bedroom, all cleaned up, Lucia directly told him to go back to his own room. The Duke didn't understand. What was wrong now? Lucia's explanation was that she had cried so much she had no energy left. The Duke immediately felt a raging fire in his heart. He believed it was all because of those hateful female guests causing trouble. He absolutely couldn't let those people off easily. He reluctantly promised Lucia that he would just sleep obediently beside her and do nothing else. Although Lucia found it hard to believe, she remembered that last night because she had to host the banquet today and needed to sleep early after telling the Duke. He really did just hold her while sleeping. While Lucia was still considering, the Duke suddenly slipped under the covers and embraced her. He promised again that he would just hold her to sleep like this, but Lucia noticed that the Duke's hands seemed a bit restless. Lucia blushed and scolded him, telling the Duke to stay away from her. However, the Duke closed his eyes and complained, "You've been busy with the banquet lately and with Damien's matters. Now that the banquet is over and Damien's registration is done, isn't it time to pay some attention to your husband?" Speaking of Damien, Lucia was curious why he was sent to a boarding school. It turned out that the Duke believed the Academy's status was rising, and it was also a good place to build connections, which would certainly be helpful for Damien. The Duke's answer was so candid that it surprised Lucia. She realized that whenever she asked a question, he would try to answer as thoroughly as possible. She had overthought it, he was just selfish, Lucia thought. To confirm her thoughts, Lucia asked the Duke a few more questions. Without exception, the Duke answered seriously and in detail. Lucia found it amazing that the Duke would answer all her questions. At this moment, the Duke reached out his hand, gently caressing Lucia's swollen eyes, his eyes full of concern. Lucia then lay in the Duke's arms, saying it should be better tomorrow. The Duke suddenly asked who had started the trouble. Lucia looked up at the Duke. Those dark eyes, she understood the Duke wanted to stand up for her, so she quickly stopped the Duke, telling him not to do anything. However, the Duke remained silent. Lucia anxiously made the Duke promise her, "In social circles, if you intervene, they won't dare to give you trouble. They'll only stab me in the back." Hearing this, the Duke angrily exclaimed, "Who dares?" But Lucia stared at the Duke with teary eyes. How could the Duke resist this ultimate move? He could only shyly turn his head away. He gave in. Lucia's expression changed instantly, reiterating, "You promised me." Unable to escape Lucia's offensive, the Duke could only cover his face helplessly and say he understood. The Duke had just promised Lucia last night not to interfere with the banquet matters. Early this morning, he took the guest list and summoned the ministers of the territory. Then he coldly announced that for the long-term development of the family, it would be better to rectify the family's conduct. The Duke's tone made the ministers feel as if they were facing a great enemy, thinking he was announcing that everyone on the list would die. After saying this, the Duke smugly thought that this level of action shouldn't violate his agreement with Lucia. After all, he didn't do anything directly. The butler beside him instantly understood that something big was about to happen. The ladies who attended the banquet were in for trouble. Sure enough, not long after, rumors began to spread in social circles that if anyone offended the Duchess, duped to run would stand up for her like a fire-breathing dragon. A week passed in the blink of an eye. Rowan was as peaceful as usual as if nothing had happened, but Damien could never forget the deep-seated feeling of helplessness he experienced at the garden party. He clenched his fists, feeling it was all because he was too weak. If his father had been there, the situation wouldn't have been so bad. Only by becoming stronger could he better protect Lucia. After Duke Tirun married her, he neither took concubines nor had lovers. Perhaps only when the Duke is hurt by someone he loves when he wakes up. He realized that the most useful things he learned at the academy were strength and power, so he came before the Duke and told him he planned to return to the academy. With determination in his eyes, he stated that he wanted to be the top student at the academy. However, the Duke replied, "As long as you can graduate successfully, this position will be yours." To this, Damien explained, "I need to hone myself to become stronger. Only then will I have the power to protect those I truly care about." Hearing the word stronger, the Duke finally looked up at Damien. "How can you prove that what you learn at the academy will make you stronger?" Damien knew that regardless of his grades, as long as he graduated successfully, the Duke's position would be his. But besides his father's gift, he also wanted to achieve something on his own. Damien clearly knew he didn't have the ability to become his father's successor, so he needed to find a way to become stronger in his own way. So he told the Duke with determination in his eyes that he wanted to become the president of the student council at the academy. Hearing this, the Duke's pen suddenly stopped. He knew what Sita meant in Damien's words. In recent years, Sita's influence had become particularly prominent in wartime, and it would only grow stronger. The Duke was puzzled. Damien, who had never been interested in anything other than studying, now suddenly wanted power. He reminded Damien, "This position isn't something you can get just by studying hard. If you can't handle it, you'll be dragged down. If you want to reach the top and stay there, you need to be strong enough that others don't dare to challenge you." Finally, the Duke told him, "You've already been registered under your mother's family." At the mention of his mother, Damien suddenly felt a bit shy. After that, the Duke told Damien to inform Lucia about his return to the academy. When Lucia suddenly learned that Damien was returning to the academy, she was saddened, thinking it was because of the garden party incident. Damien shook his head, explaining that he just wanted to keep up with the courses and improve. But Lucia still felt a bit dejected. Seeing Lucia's prolonged silence, Damien asked what was wrong. The Duke told Lucia to propose 2 conditions for the contract marriage. However, Lucia wanted neither money nor status. She wanted the Duke to promise not to initiate intimate actions towards her. The second was that she believed liking someone was beyond brain control, so she couldn't keep her heart. Lucia thought that if he was leaving tomorrow, maybe they could take a break from studying today. She looked at Damien expectantly. "Why don't we chat? Tell me what life at the academy is like." Damien happily agreed, and they spent a rare, wonderful time together. Today was the day Damien returned to the academy. Lucia, acting like a worried mother, kept talking endlessly, reminding Damien to eat well and take care of himself. The Duke, somewhat impatiently, reminded her that's enough. Lucia tried hard to remember if there was anything else to say. At this moment, the butler brought a basket and handed it to Lucia. Lucia took the basket and gave it to Damien. "Asha seems to have accepted you as her master, so you should take her with you." But Damien was a bit worried as the academy seemingly didn't allow pets. At this point, Lucia looked at the Duke and said, "Don't worry about that. Your father will take care of it." The Duke nodded in agreement. Lucia hoped that having Asha's company would make Damien's life at the academy less lonely. Damien was stunned for a moment. Then he took Asha and thanked Lucia. Finally, he bowed and said he should leave now, asking her to take care. Just as Damien turned to board the carriage, Lucia suddenly called out to him. Damien stopped and curiously poked his head out of the carriage to look at Lucia. Lucia wanted to hug him one last time before he left. After Damien agreed, Lucia ran towards him. She hugged him tightly. During this time together, Damien realized that the Duke and Duchess had a very close relationship, so sooner or later they would have their own child. This would make his position precarious. He also knew he couldn't compete with a daughter. She hoped the Duke could give her a yellow rose representing a breakup. However, the Duke was very disdainful. He thought these conditions were too simple and asked Lucia to propose something more realistic. Damien hugged Lucia back, but now he didn't mind anymore. She just wanted to protect this warmth and her mother's smile. Lucia affectionately told Damien, "Because of you, I'm happy every day. I'll miss you and write to you." These words warmed Damien, who had never experienced a mother's love before. He felt he would never forget this moment, including Lucia's expression and this warm embrace, and he would cherish this day as he strived to become stronger. Finally, Damien kissed Lucia's hand and said affectionately, "Dear mother, although I don't know and will meet again, I wish you peace and prosperity." Lucia was so moved by being called mother that tears streamed down her face. Watching Damien gradually disappear into the distance, Lucia leaned on the Duke's chest, unable to calm down for a long time. Meanwhile, in the carriage, Damien gently stroked Asha. He understood that even if a brother or sister were born one day to take his place as heir, he would sincerely give up his position, because even if such a thing happened, this precious sentiment wouldn't change. After Damien left, Lucia felt very low. She remembered that this was the first time Damien had called her mother, but now she couldn't hear it anymore. However, she then recalled the image of Damien kissing her hand. She thought about how young Damien was, yet already so charming, truly worthy of being the Duke's son. Lucia automatically blocked out the maid's repeated urging to take a bath. Completely immersed in her own world, Lucia thought that she absolutely couldn't raise Damien to become the kind of bad man who makes girls cry. Initially, she had worried about Damien being too mature, but after spending time together, she realized her concerns might have been unfounded. Damien wasn't mature because of his environment. From the beginning, his thought patterns were already close to an adult. Damien should be considered a genius. He was too smart, so it was difficult for him to have the kind of childhood ordinary children have. Lucia had once in a dream seen a child similar to Damien. His name was Bruno, a year older than Damien, with silver white hair and gray eyes. Bruno would often cause trouble to vent his dissatisfaction with his father. For example, using clever tricks to drive away family tutors and such. Lucia thought for a while if she became the Duchess, she probably wouldn't have to worry about her livelihood. Besides that, she didn't seem to need any other money. The Duke was utterly speechless. As a noble princess, she actually worried about basic necessities. He really wanted to see what was inside Lucia's head. At just 18, she seemed to have lived half a lifetime. In the end, it concluded with his father rewarding Bruno by ascending him to study at the academy. Although both were genius children, Lucia thought her Damien was much cuter than Bruno. At this moment, the Duke suddenly appeared and lifted Lucia's chin. Lucia was still surprised at his arrival. The Duke directly kissed her and pushed her down onto the sofa. At this point, Lucia came to her senses and pushed the Duke away. Blushing, she said she hadn't taken a bath yet. The Duke was exasperated, wondering why she always had to torment him like this. Then, displaying his manliness, he lifted Lucia high. He carried her on his shoulder to take a bath. Lucia wanted to call for the maids to save her, but unexpectedly, the maids tactfully and quickly left the bathroom as if they had oiled their feet. Lucia covered her blushing face in embarrassment, feeling utterly mortified. What follows is a paid segment that people don't like. The Duke actually became jealous of Damien. After bathing, they went to the bedroom. Lucia snuggled in the Duke's arms. She was still curious about many things regarding Damien. Unexpectedly, the Duke said he didn't want to hear Lucia mention another man in bed. Lucia was bewildered, saying, "What other man? That's clearly your son." But the Duke retorted that even so, it wasn't a daughter. Lucia was strangely convinced, thinking it made some sense. But what puzzled her was that although the Duke had said he didn't dislike Damien, he had never shown a loving side as a father. This attitude was almost close to indifference. What surprised her even more was that such a cold Duke could have a child as obedient and kind as Damien. So she wanted to know what kind of person Damien's birth mother was. Lucia thought that occasionally meeting the birth mother would be better for the child's mental and physical development. After all, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't compare to the unique love of a biological mother. However, the Duke told Lucia that she was dead. This answer caught Lucia completely off guard, but she thought Damien's birth mother must have been a great beauty. Lucia showed an innocent smile, believing her two requests were not excessive. However, the Duke thought these were not just reasonable, but laughably simple, so he readily agreed to Lucia's contract marriage conditions. After Lucia signed, the Duke asked Lucia if she needed notarization. This statement made Lucia very angry. The Duke also realized he had said something wrong, so he grabbed Lucia's arm, wanting to explain but didn't know how to begin. The Duke's hesitation to explain made Lucia even angrier. She coldly said, "Let's sleep and lay down." Lucia was very hurt. She couldn't help but wonder if a woman who bore a child for him wasn't worth remembering, then how much value did she, who couldn't even bear children, have in his heart? Thinking of this, Lucia resentfully questioned the Duke. "You'll probably forget what I look like in the future too, right? After all, you can't even remember the woman who gave you a child." The Duke was a bit flustered, but still didn't know how to explain. All along, Lucia had told herself not to be impatient because the path to loving him was bound to be difficult. But every time she saw the Duke's heartless and cold side, her seemingly solid resolve would crack a little. She didn't even dare to hope that she could melt the Duke's cold heart. Lucia knew the Duke didn't dislike her and maybe even like her quite a bit, but this wasn't love. Thinking of this, Lucia's emotions suddenly collapsed. She sat up and loudly questioned, "What do you mean you've never even seen her? How could she have a child for you if you've never even met?" The Duke anxiously tried to calm Lucia down. However, at this moment, Lucia couldn't hear anything. The Duke had no choice but to look into Lucia's eyes and call out her name loudly. After Lucia calmed down, the Duke finally confessed. Damien was actually the son of his twin brother. In terms of generation, he should be his nephew. The Duke finally admitted to Lucia that Damien wasn't his biological son, although Lucia was very shocked. Lucia, with her sparkling big eyes, said it wasn't necessary. With the contract completed, Lucia officially became the Duke's fiancée. She was more concerned about whether Damien himself knew. The Duke said that besides himself and now no one knows about this. Lucia asked the Duke if he would tell Damien the truth when he grew up. The Duke planned not to tell him unless Damien asked. Lucia was a bit surprised. If they never told him, then she would have to keep this secret forever. But what puzzled Lucia was that if Damien wasn't an illegitimate child, he shouldn't be subject to various prejudices. Lucia thought about it again and realized it wasn't quite right. Compared to the title of a rebellious son, being an illegitimate child was better, because in the story version Lucia had heard the twin brother who was abandoned at birth killed his father for revenge. At this point, the Duke told Lucia that there was actually more to that story. That guy was forced into a corner and had no choice but to do such a thing. Of course, part of it was also the former Duke's own fault. Lucia was very surprised. She noticed that the Duke's way of referring to his twin brother was very natural, as if they had known each other for many years. Lucia wanted to know more about the Duke's relationship with his brother, but the Duke's eyes became distant. He only answered very briefly, not wanting to reveal more. The Duke clenched his fists. He explained to Lucia, "It's not that I don't want to tell you, but this is something I'd rather die than let anyone know." At this point, Lucia took the Duke's hand. She understood the Duke because she had secrets of her own. The many things she had experienced in her dreams, she planned to keep to herself for life. Lucia comforted the Duke, saying that if telling others your secret is painful, then you don't have to tell them at all. But the Duke worried that this secret would cause Lucia pain. Lucia replied, "If that's the case, then I'll leave it to you. Please decide later whether you can tell me the secret or not." The Duke was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said he understood. Lucia caressed the Duke's cheek and they gazed at each other lovingly. Then they embraced tightly. The Duke told her to return to the palace before dark. He ordered her in a commanding tone to never disguise herself as a maid and sneak out of the palace again. Lucia was thunderstruck. She didn't understand why the Duke suddenly used such a commanding tone to speak to her. Lucia whispered in the Duke's ear, "Damien is your son and he is also my son. This will never change." Although her feelings for Damien wouldn't change, Lucia still felt some regret about not being able to be the mother of her own biological child. Lucia realized that the Duke seemed very afraid that once they had a child, the Tyran family history would become public knowledge, just as she was afraid that everything in her dreams would become reality. After learning about Damien's background, Lucia finally understood why she always felt that Damien and the Duke didn't look alike. Hearing this, the Duke was speechless. "Didn't you say before that we looked like we were cut from the same mold?" Lucia explained that in terms of appearance, that was indeed the case, but their inner selves were completely different. Words like pure and obedient seemed to not fit the Duke at all. The Duke felt like he had taken 1,000,000 points of real damage. But the next second he smiled again and hugged Lucia, saying, "But I'm pure and obedient to you, aren't I?" Lucia blushed instantly at his flotation. The next moment she hugged the Duke's head and laughed happily. The Duke then took the opportunity to push Lucia down. Lucia was curious, "Since Damien looks so similar to you, your late older brother must have looked exactly like you, right?" The Duke complained that Guy only looked decent on the outside. In reality, he was just a pushover. Lucia understood. It seemed Damien took after his father, which was why he was so pure and lovable. Lucia still wanted to know about Damien's father. Mentioning the name reminded the Duke of those painful memories. Lucia also noticed that the Duke seemed hesitant, so she said it was okay if you didn't want to say. But after a moment of hesitation, the Duke still told her that his brother was called Shio. Lucia covered her mouth in surprise because she found that this name was incredibly similar to the Duke's. The Duke was confused, wondering how they were similar. Lucia repeated the name Shio and Shio. She had 1,000,000 questions. However, the Duke said, "I've always been not very polite when talking to my woman." Then she said, "If you say them quickly, aren't they the same?" The Duke was shocked because what Lucia just said in her expression were exactly the same as his deceased brother's. Lucia caressed the Duke's cheek. "Does your name contain both your and your brother's names?" The Duke hugged Lucia tightly, calling her name repeatedly. Lucia responded passionately. The Duke now understood that his heart no longer belonged to himself. Without Lucia, he might die. The next day, the Duke finally found an opportunity to take revenge on the Countess of Wells who had made Lucia cry. He smiled mischievously. Although Lucia had asked him not to intervene, the Duke had been holding a grudge about this matter. He had always hoped to catch the Wells family's weakness, and this time he wouldn't let them off easily. The Duke ordered his subordinate Elio to thoroughly investigate the past transaction details and tax payments of the involved merchant group. He specifically emphasized not to miss even a speck of dust. Although Elio didn't know exactly what had happened, he understood that the Wells merchant group had been completely targeted by his master. And the Duke was not only a grudge-holding person but also had a long-lasting impact. Soon after, Lucia hosted another tea party. Katie also came specially to congratulate Lucia. Lucia was grateful that Katie always cared for her. Katie had heard from her father that Duke Tyran had become famous for killing all the lords of the rebellious lands along with their families. The northern nobles were extremely terrified because of this. During this time, Duke Tyran had also summoned and severely reprimanded the nobles because Lucia had been insulted. So the husbands or fathers of the noble ladies would specifically require them to attend Lucia's tea parties. Everyone was swept up in the storm. Only Lucia, at the center of the storm, was unaware and appeared very calm. Hearing this, Lucia's cheeks turned slightly red, and she spoke incoherently. When did I become your woman? We haven't even confirmed the marriage yet. The Duke told her that in the tradition of the Tyran family, there was no divorce. Katie understood that only she could explain the current situation to Lucia, but she felt it unnecessary to tell Lucia and make her worry about it. Since the Duke had stood up for Lucia, the wives of the northern nobles would rack their brains to attend Lucia's parties. Lucia also felt that the atmosphere was a bit strange on the day she hosted the tea party. Although everyone's attitude was similar, those who had attended before seemed a bit at a loss and particularly cautious. While those who hadn't attended the garden party before kept mentioning the revolution case, as if trying to gain credit, Katie was excited inside, wanting to tell Lucia the truth. It's all because your husband is too scary, but she knew she absolutely couldn't say that. So she told Lucia not to worry too much. Katie was overjoyed inside. No one would dare to casually offend Lucia in the future. Lucia looked at Katie's smile and felt somewhat strange for no reason. Later, Lucia received a letter from Damien which filled 3 pages densely. Damien's letter was like a report, clearly detailing what classes he attended and what he said. It was as if one could witness his life firsthand. At the end of the letter it was written, "The weather is getting cold. Please take care of yourself. Yours, Damien." After reading the entire letter, Lucia felt very gratified. Then she remembered that it was almost the end of the year and she needed to prepare a gift for Damien. Just then the maid informed Lucia that a guest had arrived. It turned out to be the haggard Countess of Wells. At first, Lucia was confused about who this person was. When the maid explained, Lucille was shocked. She had lost weight so quickly. Then Lucille composed herself and coldly stated that she was very displeased with what the Countess had done at the banquet. However, to Lucille's surprise, the Countess of Wells directly admitted that she had been foolish due to her old age and pleaded for Lucille's magnanimity to forgive her. Lucia was somewhat astonished. She hadn't expected the Countess of Wells to admit her mistake so easily. This made her suspect that something wasn't right. However, since the Countess of Wells had already apologized, the kind-hearted Lucia didn't intend to pursue the matter further, so she accepted the apology and prepared to leave. At this moment, the Countess of Wells called out to Lucia. She had one more reluctant request for Lucia. Lucia felt a bit dazed and terrified. However, Lucia still had one question. She didn't understand why he was so impolite to his fiancée, but the Duke simply stated that it was just his preference. Hearing this, Lucia felt a bit angry. How dare she still ask for a favor? How thick-skinned. It turned out she wanted to ask Lucia to appease the Duke's anger. She confided in Lucia about the difficulties their family's merchant group was facing, hoping the Duke would show mercy. That evening, Lucia brought up this matter to the Duke. However, the Duke believed that as a leader, it was reasonable to call for a cleanup of family conduct. Lucia thought it was too outrageous. She said, "There are now rumors that you severely punished the Wells Earls merchant group because of the garden party incident. You're supposed to be someone who clearly separates public and private matters." The Duke felt very embarrassed and could only sheepishly respond, "Of course." Soon after, following a thorough investigation, the Wells Earls merchant group was finally released without charges. However, the amount of levy remained unchanged. As a result, Duke Tyran's identity as a wife-protecting maniac became a consensus in the northern social circles. Of course, all of this was within Katie's expectations. People thought he had fallen in love, but soon after, rumors spread that Duke Tyran only needed a wife in name. Lucia looked at the man before her. At first, she thought the Duke was scary. Later, she considered him a playboy. She didn't know what the Duke's true personality was like. She felt a bit uneasy. Sure enough, the Duke brought up again that Lucio was not allowed to leave the palace at will. Lucio was at a loss. She didn't know how to persuade the Duke because she wanted to meet her friend Lerman outside the palace once before getting married. At this moment, the Duke told her that he didn't let Lucia leave the palace just to keep their secret engagement. He didn't want others to find out. It wasn't that she couldn't leave the palace for life. Lucia's face lit up with joy. So you mean I can leave the palace after we're married, right? The Duke was startled by Lucia's sudden change. However, he reminded Lucia not to reveal anything about their contract marriage.